Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young, and it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Good morning. I have the pleasure today of talking to David Jesu-Dawson about his work, his book on Desi pubs. And he's speaking to us from London. Remind me where? You're in South London.
Yeah, Southeast London, Lewisham, where I live.
In Lewisham, yes. So sort of my old stomping grounds, or at least close to that. This is a topic that I feel quite chagrined. I didn't know about this type of third place when all the years I lived in England. But tell us about your background and how you became interested in this particular type of pub. And then we're going to really go into the history of them.
So I've been a journalist for about more than 20 years now, nearly 25 years. I've written about beer quite recently. And what happens is that I realised that certain sections of British life, particularly when it comes to people of colour, have been massively underreported, mainly because beer writing is kind of very white pursuit, very male, male, white,
and very male, yeah.
Yes. And so stories of people of colour, but also stories of working class life have gone under the radar for a long time. And so the idea of so I think what you really want to know is, what is a Desi pub? Okay.
Yes.
And what does Desi mean? So Desi is a Sanskrit word that means the home or homeland. And in this case, it refers to India. So you are a Desi if you've left India. So someone living in India isn't
the country of India, not South Asia in general.
No, it's that's a bone of contention in certain ways, because the word is pre-partition, so it can be used to describe brown people in general and Pakistanis, that kind of thing. But so Desi is also a word which people use in all different manners of meanings to mean like Desi style, like, you know, we're going to have it in the Indian style, that kind of thing. People are familiar with it within the Asian Indian diaspora to a certain extent. And when it relates to Desi pubs, it is basically pubs that were set up from the 1960s onwards to give safe space to Indian drinkers, because pubs in the 1950s onwards in this country were either very hostile to anyone who wasn't white, or they were segregated. And so segregation meant that pubs were segregated anyway before this time, in terms of class. So you had a smoking room, a lounge, that kind of thing. And so what happened was that the landlords just assumed that anyone of colour would be working class, and so they weren't allowed in the slightly posher rooms. But basically this was racism, and it manifested itself in the kind of segregation that you would be familiar with in the past in South Africa and in America. They had all sorts of justifications for all this kind of stuff. And interestingly, Malcolm X visited Smethwick, which is a town in the Midlands. We call it the Black Country. It's outside Birmingham. And he went to a pub with this guy called After Jahal Singh, who was a member of the Indian Workers Association. And he wanted to show him a segregated pub. So they took him to one room of the pub and they tried to get served, and they weren't allowed to be served because they weren't white. And so he said it was worse than, his quote was, it was worse than in Harlem at the time. And this was, forgive me, I might not get the exact date wrong, but we're looking at the early 1960s. It was shortly before he was assassinated. I think it was within 10 days of him before he was assassinated. And so that drew a lot of, that highlighted these issues that we're talking about. But Desi pubs would be set up because the work of people like that after Johal Singh that I mentioned. What they would do is they would go to a pub where they weren't going to be served in a certain room. They would go with a white comrade because they were communists, and they would be served the drink. And then when the landlord said to them, "Sorry, you've got to leave," they would then give evidence against these landlords when their licenses came up for renewal, which, magistrates or whatever licensing meetings. And so they lost the pubs, and then the pubs were taken over by Indian people, or as I call them, Asian people. I know you call Asian people in America something. So when I say Asian people, I'm talking about Indian people from India. And so these pubs were originally set up as a sort of community spaces for Indian people who had arrived from the 1950s onwards. So
and
they
were there many of
where
them? Was this?
What do you mean?
I mean, were there lots of them, or just a few?
So the way Britain and its empire was set up was that from 1945, after the Second World War, everyone fought for the Allies. So like people like my parents, my mum's from Malaysia, my dad's from Singapore, and my dad is of Indian heritage. So everyone on my family fought for the British. We were all part of Britain. So Malaysia, the Malaya Peninsula was part of the British Empire. And so what that meant is that people who lived in these countries, all their wealth, all their tax, as well as fighting, came to this country, came to England. And so when the Commonwealth was set up, we all, effectively our family all have British passports. And when the Second World War, after the Second World War, Britain was in huge decline because of the cost of the war, and the NHS had to be set up. So the NHS was part of the deal of offering homes for heroes, that kind of thing, the welfare state. And so the NHS was set up by people from India, people from the empire. So you would call it mass migration, but I would say that we were British subjects. We're subject to the Queen well into the from the 19th from like the 18th century onwards. So we had, my parents had a British education. They spoke English. They was British as you could imagine. So the idea that, so was there many? Well, the answer is like yes. But we always were part of this country, even when we were in another country. I mean, I was born in this country in 1978. So and.
But the Asians came after the war, and then there were there was a large influx of people from the Caribbean in the 60s. So that's later on.
So we're talking.
I'm just trying to get the weight of people from the empire.
Yeah. So from 1948 it's called the Windrush generation, which was a boat that came, but many people came on airplanes as well. It's kind of overplayed, this Windrush thing. So the people that you're talking about from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, they came similarly. They were empire children of the empire as well. With that they're very British in the way that their manners and things like that. And there's the same with the people from Southeast Asia, that kind of thing. They were needed in this country. Britain couldn't function without them. They needed their labour because no one wanted. With the NHS being set up, they had to fill the hospitals with staff. My mum and dad came here in the 1970s, early 1970s, to work in hospitals. Because this country would advertise in Commonwealth countries saying, we need you to come. It wasn't a case of you like now where it's very difficult to do this, especially post Brexit and especially in the climate that America has. You have to remember that they were British anyway, and they were needed in their country. So
well, I mean, you can look at the figures. the mills are full of people from certain villages, almost it's like the whole village.
Yes, like you're talking about like the textile industry in Manchester, which is so all of that this is all like empire. The cloth came from India. It was, it's all one part of the whole thing. The whole richness of Europe is based on colonization and the labor of other countries.
So then we have all these people who have been, British educated, they're English speaking, but they've come to Britain, to England, and they look different. And so they're not made to feel welcome when they go to a pub. I mean, the quintessential thing, right, for we think of as a pub, but then but they weren't, you said, but they weren't welcome in pubs.
So like, as well as like, you've got to remember that like colonization is based on racism. So the idea that someone would go to another country and feel that they were able to take advantage of the resources was based on the idea of white supremacy. So people in this country in general believed in white supremacy. So if people came here, I mean, obviously not everyone, but a vast majority of people, particularly the kind of person that would run a pub or a business, would see themselves as far superior to anyone who wasn't white. So that created a hostile environment in people's leisure time. First of all, people were coming here to work in very horrible situations, like you mentioned the mills, but in the Midlands where Malcolm X visited, these were foundries that were servicing the car industry, because at the time Britain had a car industry. It doesn't have it anymore, but these were like really, really hot, horrible conditions that they were working in.
Yeah, tough jobs.
And so they needed to have beers, because what would happen is that the white workers in the foundry would, at their lunchtime, they would go to the pub and they would neck 4 pints of mild, which is like a very weak beer. And so they expected to do the same thing as well. So this is all just about like white British people didn't see people coming over here as a permanent thing. Whereas the dream that was sold to people like my family, my parents, was that you come over here, you can lead a life that was described as enriched compared to where my parents grew up. But actually, where my parents grew up is like, my dad grew up in Singapore, is now one of the richest countries in the world. Malaysia's very rich. And where they found themselves actually going from like lower middle class to being working class here. And that's the lie that was told, as well as the fact that everyone was very hostile to them and there was a lot of racism. So the idea that they came here for better lives and jobs really didn't materialize in the way that, and that's where you have this idea of lots of wealth in this country is still in the same hands as it was before. People who have families with colonial history are the ones that are still the ones that control the power in this country.
And this idea, for me, because I'm writing about third places, and one of the questions that comes up often is diversity of different sorts, because you could talk about young and old, you can talk about women feeling welcome too. But this is such a clear case, and people found a workable solution to it at the time, and then that's evolved over the years, and it's from the things you've written.
Yeah.
It's different, and that it seems to me that there's some really interesting things for us to learn today from this story. I mean, both the sad situation that led to people having to set up Desi pubs, but then their role today too is quite interesting. And
so they were set up initially as a sort of part of banditry and resistance against racism, but they moved into becoming inclusive spaces for all different types of people. So when you go to places like Birmingham, West London, and you go to one, you'll notice there are a lot of white people who there, and they claim them as their own as well because of the food. So the success of Desi pubs is built on the success of Indian food in Britain. So in the 90s, under New Labour, I think Robin Cook, who was the then Foreign Secretary, said that chicken tikka masala is the British national dish. And throughout the late 90s, early noughties, there was this idea that we had the best food in the country, and it was Indian food. And so, but what Desi pubs offer, so Desi pubs are 90% Punjabi, so the Punjab, and then 10%.
So explain to listeners what that means in terms of.
The Punjab is an area of India that was fractured very much by partition. It had huge problems.
This is the partition between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Yeah. So Punjabis in general in this country are Sikhs. So they're renowned for being soldiers and fighting frontline with the British. But when they came over here, they were seen as agricultural workers, so they worked those hard jobs in the foundries. But they are truly Indian in the sense of cuisine, because the British curry house isn't actually an Indian construct; it's a Bangladeshi construct. So it's Bangladeshis giving you an approximation of what Indian food is. And curry houses were white spaces. They were cooking. They didn't start off like that. They came. The first Bangladeshis came in the 19th century, and they were seamen, and they were coffee shops. But curry houses became, in the 1960s onwards, places that white people would go to after going to the pub. Now, Desi pubs are totally different to that because it's Punjabis doing Punjabi food with a sort of big emphasis on the mixed grill. Now, so a mixed grill is loads of different types of marinated meats, chicken wings, chops, tikka pieces, that kind of thing. It's cooked on a bed of onions, and it's like a barbecued style meat, and it's perfect for a pub because it can be shared, that kind of thing. Curry house's food tried to fit the model of a Western restaurant in that you have a starter, a main course, and a dessert. And it wasn't the kind of food that we would eat at home at all. The idea of having a samosa as a starter still makes me laugh whenever I go past a curry house. But I think eventually people worked out you'd have many dishes and you'll share them around. And so you get really good curries in Desi pubs as well, that kind of thing. So they've become this sensation, and it particularly built on a lot of like people watching sports like in the pub or going to a football ground after the pub, but having mixed grills with their beers before.
So did Desi pubs always have food? Because lots of pubs did not have food. You'd be lucky to get a packet of chips or a little bag of peanuts.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because you've always got experience of this country, but you're right, because the default of a pub in the past, in the 80s, and when I was growing up in the 90s, there were wet-led pubs. But what started to happen is that when the Desi pubs were set up and into the 80s and stuff, is they started to cook things like kebabs, shish kebab, chicken tikka kebab, put them in, and there wasn't necessarily a menu, but it was like you could even have masala omelette. And it was as it progressed when Indian food became massive in this country, they were like, okay, we need to get big grills, we need to get all this stuff. And then as time has gone on and because the reason why pubs didn't serve food was because traditionally people would have beers after work and then go home and eat.
Yes.
But now our leisure time has changed. The amount of hours we work has changed, and so food in a pub has become a thing. You do get
right, and often people I remember the guys, they'd go to the pub after cricket, and then they'd go out for a curry.
Yeah, but this is, so times have changed, and we're now got we don't have as much leisure time as we do, and so we do have to eat out in pubs and that kind of thing. And so it fits that. The kind of experience that you can get in these pubs, though, is that you don't have to eat. You can just have beers. They're not restaurants. But the food's so great. It's that once you see it,
right, you smell it. How could you not
grills
eat?
are like, the mixed grills are sizzling platters. They fill the room with smoke.
Yeah.
So you're like, okay, I want to have one of those. And there's like a few of you could share one. They're sharers, so it's really good, and it works really well in a pub. It's the communal eating, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's and because it's not, so curry houses were renowned for using colorants, using lots of added sugar, that kind of thing. The food isn't like that in Desi pubs, mainly because they're cooked for people like me who have grown up with curries that are, a bit more, that don't have all those additives.
What's about the atmosphere? How would you compare the atmosphere in a Desi pub to a more conventional, English, old-fashioned English pub?
Pretty much the same. Much the same. I tell you what, you'll be completely familiar with a lot of them because they tend to take over old pubs. Some of them, particularly in the very successful ones in the West Midlands, in the Black Country, as I keep mentioning, they have done these very expensive refits, including retractable roofs, that kind of thing. But you will be very familiar if you're traditional pubs. You'll be it basically is a traditional pub. You
just have better food.
Yeah, that's it, really. Food, but there is the sort of community element is very important. So I'm a big fan of pubs in general, right? So what pubs offer is a third space, as you've mentioned, where you can talk to people who you might not normally talk to. Like if you try to go to your local supermarket and chat to the staff there, then they'll eventually say, "I'm sorry, we're on the clock here." Whereas if you go to a pub, it's about chat. And so Desi pubs are completely like that. They were opened for that purpose. So you can just go and sit at the bar and talk to people, and you can meet different types of people. And I think in this day and age, get a bit romanticized them now, when we're becoming a bit polarized, where we're not often hanging out with people with differing political views. The pub is a place where we can meet halfway and then try and heal a bit of our hurts.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because this comes up quite a lot, is that, what is it that makes a place, well, the whole idea of exclusion, and then what makes people feel welcome. And I asked this, I had an experience recently. I went to a little local group that was supposed to be open, a kind of drop-in thing. And I have never been cut so cold for no reason I know of. I mean, I was treated like I was invisible.
Sorry to hear.
And
that's horrible.
It was very strange. It was just in my town. I didn't know anyone there. I don't think they, knew me and had some bad opinion of me. And I thought, I've never, even as a woman going into a place that I felt a little bit uncomfortable. And I thought, I'd really like to think about, what it feels like. I think it's really important for people in terms of developing some empathy for other people and to understand how important it is to create a welcoming and non-exclusionary atmosphere in a third place. What happened if someone walked into a pub and wasn't welcome? Would they just be cut cold? Would they be refused a drink? How would it feel? I'm asking you, I hope you've never experienced that, but I imagine you.
No, of course I've experienced it. I mean, my first ever
tell
pub,
us about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so my first ever pub I went to, so I grew up in a very white majority small town. In fact, I was the only person of colour in my whole school. And when I went to the pub, I was completely mocked. I opened the door and they all shout. I think someone shouted taxi out because the only interaction they've had with brown people were people who drive taxis. And so I think what I've experienced is that there's outright hostility like that. And then there's excuses about, I've had times where I've not been served, where they'll say, oh, you do realise this is a locals pub. You do realise this is ex-football team's pub, or something like that. And just basic, or not given eye contact, someone giving my change, just hostility, which mean I'd be foolish to come back to. And then you have the sort of low-level hostility where they might not necessarily mean badly, but you don't feel like you can be your authentic self. I remember once being in a pub where it was a pub which had all different stuff on the menu, and I ordered the curry, and the guy came out and he kept hassling me as to whether or not I liked the curry, and it was making a big thing out of it and in front of everyone. And I just was like, I just don't feel myself. And so what you want to do to be able to feel welcomed and included is to be your authentic self. So I'm sorry, Karen, you had that experience, but I wouldn't ever change your behavior or who you are when you go to a third space, because it's called code shifting. You know, you don't want to not be your authentic self. So you feel cheated by the interaction, but so does the person who's you're interacting with, because they're not learning about someone who's different. Do you see? We are different. We can't.
Yep.
But
right.
So you have to just like, first of all, there just has to be niceness and politeness, and this has to be uniform to everyone. So problem with pubs in the past is that certain groups were seen as troublemakers. So as soon as you walk into a pub and you're a bit different for everyone else, you're on probation. You've not done anything wrong, but it creates this feeling of hostility. And so
I had a boyfriend from Glasgow once.
Yeah.
He said,
so what?
Everyone, as soon as they heard he's this mild-mannered guy, as soon as they heard he was from Glasgow, they were like, oh, dangerous.
Yeah. So like, what? I mean, that's horrible. These are, and also we have to like talk about why these come about. And you've mentioned a few things, and I think a lot of them in this country are class-based issues.
Yes.
I mentioned the segregation of the pubs were class, but so people have these assumptions of areas based on class. So a lot of the places in this book that are in London or Birmingham haven't been visited by people of that own who live in that city. They just stick to very white metropolitan areas. And they're losing out by not visiting these type of places, I would say. They're not. It's real multiculturalism is you go everywhere and see how everything is. Because as a white person, you're welcome everywhere. There's the fallacy that the far right give is this idea that places are no-go zones and all this kind of stuff. Like one of these, I won't mention his name, but one of these fascist toe rags was like filming parts of Whitechapel, which I think is like one of the best places you can go to just by Brick Lane. There's so much to gain. It's so diverse, rich. And he was saying, oh, look at this, a mosque, all this kind of thing. And it's just like, get a life, mate. Because the people in my book that I spoke to, the white people who love these pubs, they've seen their area changed. And instead of like moving somewhere else, they've thought, okay, let's see what happens. And they've seen their pubs thrive, because the pubs that were taken over by a lot of Desis were failing. And so they had their lives enriched by a different diaspora. And I think that like, this is a story that's not often told, that we can have our lives enriched by changes.
Well, that's the thing. I was thinking that people don't realize that the pleasure one gets from being with people who are different from you is something, unless you've experienced it, you don't know. But it really, like life expands. It's interesting. You go, wow, I didn't know about this. But the other thing I've been thinking about diversity in third places is that if a place is diverse, you know something's being done right in the background. It's like a signal that a place has that welcoming feeling, that whoever's running it is making people feel it's an environment that people feel that they can be themselves and, connect with other people. But, do you have any thoughts about how, who struggles most with this? Is it, people after COVID, people got quite unaccustomed to just dealing with anyone face to face?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a fair point, really, is that a lot of people who shout the loudest have something missing in their lives when it comes to like what do you fear exactly? What is it about? Why are you like this? And it's a lot of like insular. I think ultimately, like, Britain is a very insular country when it comes to class, which does mean that you hang out with certain types of people who are similar to you culturally, but also we have pubs, and pubs are like at the end of the road. You go in and then you can meet lots of different people, and it's a diversity of not only color but a diversity of age. I mean, the pub's very, very exciting because when I was growing up, you're in schools and you're always with the same age groups, but when you go to a pub you can meet all different types of ages of people, and that was very exciting.
Right.
And I think that, like, that's really important, that you can have that, and then diversity of sex and gender. But unfortunately, in this country, we do have a problem with women and pubs. There's fewer women drinking beer year on year, which is quite surprising when you compare it to America. So
Interesting.
and I think there's things that America does do well when you compare
Uh-huh.
it to this country. I think that when I took American friends to a Desi pub, they were surprised at how it was all just going on low level. Like, there was no shouting about it. It was all just, you know, we weren't making a big deal out of this.
Uh-huh.
And I think that it's interesting. I found that quite interesting, that kind of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's
Could
to do
could you
with.
tell us about a couple of the pubs that you write about in your book, a favorite pub or two?
So the big pub that changed me really was the Gladstone in Borough, which is not a traditional area for a Desi pub. It was opened in 2000, and I'm going to say 2016. I might be wrong there. Probably
Mm-hmm.
2018. I'll have to check.
Uh-huh.
And they just took over a pub, and they had a sort of tradition of pie and a pint. And so they carried on the pie and the pint thing with chicken tikka, masala, lamb matar paneer pies, that kind of thing. But they
Oh, they
basically,
put them in pie crust? They put
yeah, and
them
I
in a
think,
pie? Oh,
yeah, yeah,
huh, huh.
and and I think they call it Anglo-Indian fusion food. I mean, all this food, all curries and stuff, are Anglo-Indian food, fusion foods, really. But the thing that the special part of what they did, and I think is that they could have easily just been brown people working in a pub, which was for white people, but they stamped their identity and culture on it. They did Bhangra nights, that kind of thing. Diwali was a big important thing for them,
Mm-hmm.
and so it created a very diverse clientele. So there was like the normal white people, middle class white people, working class white people, but then Asian people started to come as well, started to travel in from other
Uh-huh.
areas. And I think that it was based on their friendliness as well. Like, they always introduced you to the locals when you came in. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's something that you don't often get in London pubs.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah. That
So,
that
like,
sense. So they
yeah,
they actually took hosting seriously.
yeah, I think so. And I think, like, London can be a bit of a lonely place. Although
Mm.
I say that people say that I kind of like London because you know where you are with people. People don't want to talk. They don't talk. People can be friendly. I do live in a nice part of London that's very green and quite near to the
Mm-hmm.
centre. Very, very lucky, really. And so people, when they're walking their dogs, will say hello to you, that kind of thing, which you don't probably get in other cities or other.
Maybe. I mean, Camberwell, my neighborhood was incredibly friendly and close. I mean, I
Yeah,
have tons.
so
Yeah.
yeah, so you asked about why there weren't any Desi pubs in Camberwell, and I think the answer is because, so growing up, so when people in Southeast London who were of colour, they weren't served in. So where I live, the pubs were either segregated, including different toilets, or they just wouldn't serve people of colour, and so people travelled to Brixton to these Jamaican pubs, which were opened from the
Mm.
1960s
Yep.
onwards, and unfortunately they no longer exist And I think it's quite interesting when you compare them to Desi pubs. And I think the reason why they don't exist is because there wasn't at the time, like the 90s, the noughties, there wasn't the thing about Jamaican food, jerk food being like the national dish. And I think that so Desi pubs pivoted into these spaces that were food orientated.
So the food was leading. Yeah. So what is in Brixton? So what kind of pubs are in Brixton then? Just kind of
the pubs. Pubs like the Angel were set up in the 1960s onwards, and they were for Jamaican and Caribbean drinkers. And people from all across London used to go to them. And they had like reggae on the jukebox. Thing. But I think what was really interesting is that this is like my parents' generation going drinking. And they were like spaces for female people. There was lots of fun, dominoes, but they weren't hugely raucous. But they kind of mirrored British pubs. And they had strippers, for example, that kind of thing.
Wow.
So but this is all part of like British pub history, but it's
an evolution, really,
an evolution of pubs, because pubs were traditional spaces, that kind of thing, and now they're not, even you go to like the Lamb in Conduits in Lamb Conduits, which is right by Great Ormond Street Hospital, and it's run by two gay guys. So there's a lot of people bemoan the fact that you don't have gay pubs anymore, or that they're declining, and and it's because it was a very, very good place for people to go and then come out and find their sexuality, that kind of thing. But now the argument is you can do that in all pubs.
Yeah.
And so we have got, and it's the same with like, there's an Asian person could grow up in an area like me who never goes to a Desi pub, and they can feel certain things and be themselves. But I wasn't truly myself until I went to a Desi pub. That's what we talked about, this authentic self, this code switching. That was when I finally got it. And it's because I didn't have to look over my shoulder all the time, because I was in the majority. And so if I ever feel that I need that, I'll travel across London and go to Southall, go to wherever, and just sit there, have a few beers and watch the cricket. And so it's a wonderful life.
That's neat. Well, I can't wait to get to London and explore. We'll have to have a drink, and I will put the link to your book about Desi pubs in the notes. But there's just lots more to this story, and it's a really great window into 20th century British history too.
No worries. And if any of your listeners wants a copy of the book, they can email me. But it is also available on Kindle as well.
Okay. Terrific. Well, I look forward to meeting you, and thank you so much for joining me.
No worries.
Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at KarenChristensen.substack.com.